Okay, what do you want to talk about with the Sabbath or anything else? Bring it on. I didn't use them. It was a gift that I didn't use. Would have been really great, really warm, really helpful in the wintertime. I mean, it's in Michigan, especially when we tell people where we're from. If you ever met somebody from Michigan and you're like, where are you from? And we would all just kind of point where we're at in the mitten because it's the shape of, it would have made it a lot easier, to show people where I was from. And so I didn't use the mittens. I just tucked them away. Sabbath is a gift, but only if you use it. Maybe I should have said it more clearly. In my head, on my notes, it was clear, but if it didn't come out, that's, that's where I'm still learning how to, as a communicator. I mean, preachers are also communicators, right? You're trying to be like, the message needs to be heard. Now you know what it meant. See? Yes. I was talking with Brittany earlier, and she was talking about not being outgoing and not looking forward to like the meet and greet thing. She's like, can I just hide out over here and not greet anybody and all this stuff? And so I was giving her some pointers like, hey, listen, if you want to come out of that shell just a little bit, start with a very small thing. And so I talked about a college class, and I said, would you ever raise your hand and ask a question during class? She's like, no. I said, what about going up to the professor after class and saying, hey, I didn't understand this? Because here's the thing, like, if you're not understanding it, there's a good chance a whole lot of other people didn't get it. And so you might be doing the class a favor by you asking the clarification question. And so, anyway, that needed to be clearer. And if I was preaching it like multiple services, it's like, okay, I would make sure to say that more clearly in the next one. That's why I think if you go to one of those big churches that has like multiple services on like Saturday and Sunday, you're really a guinea pig on the first service. You're really the one that's kind of the test group to see if it worked. And so, by the last time they preached, I think probably the last one, the pastor's also tired of saying the same thing 4 or 5 times. So I think the second or third one's the sweet spot, But we don't have any worry about that. We're not that big. So you get one with me, That's it. What else, can be cleared up or additional? Because we didn't get deep in, well, maybe we did, but we didn't get deep into a lot of the parts of it. But we'll cover a lot more in depth on some of the Sabbath things over the next 2 weeks, and specifically also when the Israelites failed at Sabbath keeping and what it cost them. And so we'll get through that and then look at what it costs us when we fail to keep Sabbath. But yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think part of it was Jesus was trying to get us to understand. So with David and the showbread, Jesus wasn't saying, see, they did something wrong with that, so it's okay if we do something wrong now. What he was trying to get them to understand, and sometimes I wonder, why did Jesus even like talk with the Pharisees instead of do like talk to the hand, and just walk away? I'm thinking because with that situation, he wanted to start showing them that it's more important that life is sustained than did we adhere to a rule that in and of itself doesn't matter. In other words, the showbread was there for a purpose, and there were rules concerning what got done with it when it was time for the new hot fresh bread of the presence to be put there. What gets done with this? Do you destroy it? Does it just get tossed out to low-income people that are hungry? Who eats it? Well, it was designed for and provided for in God's law for it to only be for the priest. Partially, that was his provision for the priests. And you kind of think like, thanks, I want the dry bread, God. Like it's a little crunchy now, But, they didn't put all the stuff in it that we put in bread these days from the grocery store where it lasts longer. But it's like that was God's way of providing for the priests, or one of his ways of providing for the priests. So now when you're up to it and you're like, well, here's David with his men and they're hungry. And David lied, by the way. The last time I was gone, Rob Nemeth was a young guy that preached. He preached on like that passage, and his probably had a lot of questions that got unanswered where you're like, what does that have to do with that? But if you go back and listen to it, it's online, you'll be like, oh, okay, I see what was going on. But he talked about this in his message, and David did lie to that priest. He told him, I'm on a mission for the king. Well, no, he's running away from the king because the king's mission was to kill David. Like, at that point, Saul is trying to kill David. Amy, what was it we heard on that message we were listening to where he said it was like however many years between the commissioning of David and his consecration and his commissioning, or however the words were. But the time between when David was anointed to be king, huh? Yeah, it was a lot of years. No, that was the Paul thing. It was a long time from when David was anointed to be king and when he was actually crowned as king was a long time. And that was the other thing with the Apostle Paul, like from the time God anointed him to the time he actually commissioned him to go into ministry was between 3 and 17 years, depending on where you're reading it in the scriptures. But it was a number of years that David and Saul both were given a job to do by God, but before they were actually able to embark on that job. And so with the showbread, so he is actually lying to the priest about what he's doing and who's going to partake in it. And he's about to go meet up with his buds in the army, but he doesn't even have any gear. And he says, do you have any weapons here? And I love it that in the house of the Lord, he's like, I need to get armored up. He went to the house of the Lord for his armory. I love that, And he's like, yeah, I've got a sword. It was Goliath's sword. And David's like, oh yeah, I remember that one. Like, I cut Goliath's head off with that sword. There's nothing like it. I'll take it, How cool is that? And that priest gives David the showbread, and he takes it to his compatriots, and they eat off of it, But the shortened up answer to get back to it is, it was provision for life. It was life-saving, and the priest decided in that moment that it was more important for life to be preserved than for a guideline or rule to be legalistically observed. So what Jesus is saying is, okay, so these guys are grabbing some heads of grain, rubbing them, blowing the chaff, eating the grain. You're calling that work? It's not harvesting, it's preserving life. Now, granted, they weren't about to die from hunger. Like, we say that sometimes, like, oh, I'm about to die, I'm so hungry. No, you're not, okay? Like, don't be dramatic. Maybe if you've got blood sugar issues, you're about to pass out, but you're not going to die most likely, Like, that's a real thing that I understand we deal with a lot in this country. I don't think diabetes was such a big thing back in the day for Jesus, so I don't know that was a consideration. So we do have to consider that. Like, okay, maybe I'm not going to die, but am I about to pass out? I need to eat. Well, you might have adopt a rule. Like, our family has kind of decided within the last several months or so, if we can really avoid it, we don't go out to dinner at a restaurant on Sundays. Now, we used to do that quite often. Part of it was routine, part of it was laziness, part of it was just not wanting to go home and cook, so we would, let somebody else do it for us. And you know what? We both kind of got to this agreement that we said, we don't want to do that anymore. And the only exception would be, like if there was a visitor at church and I wanted to get some time with them and they were willing to go out, I would take them to dinner because we don't have anything automatically ready, nor do we have really a dining room in the parsonage. It's like we have a little 2 to 4 person table in the kitchen. So that's kind of out, So it's like, we'll go to a restaurant. And I meant to say this in the notes and that got missed or something in the sermon, but I've heard a few preachers say this, and I tend to agree, and that's if you're going to go out to lunch on a Sunday, which is notoriously the worst day for servers, like they see you coming up in church clothes, whatever that means anymore, they automatically know my tip has gone down the drain. Christians are apparently notoriously terrible tippers on Sundays, apparently, especially sometimes where people will leave a gospel tract in lieu of a tip. If you want to leave a gospel tract, it better have a lot of cash in it. You know what I'm saying? And so what a few pastors are saying is suggesting is if you're going to dinner after church on Sunday and therefore necessitating or helping take part in necessitating that somebody is working there, because I can tell you I've invited a number of servers to church when they find out I'm a pastor and they say, well, I work most Sundays. Now, sometimes that's a cop-out on their part and sometimes that's legitimate. And I realized the irony in me showing up on a Sunday afternoon and saying, why don't you come to my church? And they say, well, because of you people, like, oh. And so as we started kind of realizing that, and we said, in our household, we're going to change that. It's not a legalistic thing, but it's like, I don't want to be part of the problem that prevents them from being able to come to the house of the Lord to worship. And so if you must, consider leaving something in the order of a 50% to 100% tip. Why? That shouts out a message that you're valued and we appreciate you being here, and we're not going to be taking advantage of that. But if you already knew that we were a Christian, especially if we said at the beginning, hey, would you, we're going to pray for our meal, is there anything we can lift you up in prayer about? They already expect, oh great, they're going to pray for me and not tip me, And then all of a sudden you shatter their preconceptions by saying, here it is. So that's just kind of an encouragement of how that might work. It's like if you can afford to go to dinner, maybe you can afford to leave a big tip too. Even as a teenager, I taught other teenagers that, and when I would help with teen groups, I would always tell them, I'm like, we're going to go to, Chili's or something like that, and it, relatively cheap, but if you buy anything, even a glass of water, you're leaving them a tip, and it's going to be a good one, because you don't come to a restaurant and not, say, oh, I can only afford this, but I can't afford the tip. I guess you're going home then, isn't it? It's macaroni and cheese for you. So, fair enough. That's not legalistic. That's Christian witness, That's being consistent in what we're saying. If we want you to be in a service, we also don't want to participate in you not being able to be in the service. So, it doesn't hurt to fill up your gas tank on Saturday, get your groceries on Friday or Saturday, maybe even make some food that you don't have to go to the bother of cooking unless you just enjoy it, because I do enjoy it. But unless you just enjoy, like if you just want to go home and have a meal, eat a simple meal, eat a sandwich, or have something you can warm up that you made the night before. These are practical things to do with the Sabbath that are beneficial to you. But it's more than just not working. It's about spending time with God. It's about having a devoted time where you don't have distractions around you and you're just able to focus on time with Christ. I've been talking too much. Your turn. Sure.
I try to make an hour in the morning.
Yeah.
Get up, have coffee, take my time,
Mhm.
and then get up to do whatever. Now, can that be part of your Sabbath gift?
Yeah.
You are, when you're going to be busy on Sunday? Or
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I asked the question on our table discussions is, does it matter what day you observe Sabbath on? I mean, the easy answer is no, it doesn't matter. I can give you logical and biblical reasons why that's the answer. But, and I can get into those for a minute, but I'll try to do it briefly, which I'm notoriously terrible at. First of all, in Genesis where it says God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, we don't actually know which day of the week that is. We assume it was the Sabbath day, Saturday, whatever that might be. But that's because that's when the Jews began observing it was on that day. But you got to think, the Hebrew language didn't even exist at the time of creation. We don't know what the language was. It all got changed at the Tower of Babel. So we don't know what the lineage of which weekday is the actual seventh day that God rested on. Not only that, but there have historically throughout human history have been different types of calendars. The Egyptians used a 10-day calendar. It was a horrible mess because it really couldn't account for the full annual cycle, so it would need to be adjusted. Our calendar that's based on our weeks and months isn't perfect because we have, different months or different lengths of time. February's a real weird one, especially every fourth year when we add a leap year to make it all even out. But then actually I think it's every 100 years you skip a leap year, or it's stuff about this that I don't even remember. But the point is, before we got into the calendar system that we are in, we don't really have a way to track back to say this one particular day is the Sabbath day that God rested on. In other words, we don't know which which cycle of a day, we don't know which day it really was on that God rested. So we can't say, well, that's the day that we must rest. Because really, when you're reading through Genesis 1, it says, well, there was evening and morning the first day, the second day, the third day. The seventh day, God sanctified, and because he rested on it. Now, God didn't need a break. He didn't need to rest. He did that as an example for us. It's literally built into creation that that day is a non-production day, not producing anything. And so much of our lives, we are based on what am I putting out there? What benefit did I add to my life or to the world today? What did I produce? What did I improve? What did I increase? That might be if you're employed, it might have been the job that you had. Matt, like you're going to go to work, you're going to punch the clock, you're going to accomplish something that benefits your company, and then they, in return, pay you for doing that. It might be if you have a day off, you're like, well, I got a day off. There's all these things around the house that need to get done, so I'm going to accomplish those things today. And then it comes down to it, and you say, where was the rest? For me, I say, well, here I am, and it's Sunday, and so today isn't my day of rest. I woke up early this morning. I did my spiritual time and preparation and all those things, and then I go here and show up and turn things on and get stuff going and make sure we've got everything in its place, and then I'm going to be standing for a while, and I'm going to be thinking, making sure that everything's just right until the doors are closed and the lights are off and everybody's gone, and then I can go home and rest. And that first time I sit down, I still haven't sat down since earlier, I don't know when. I've been standing quite a bit. That's fine. Until I sit down, probably when I get home or maybe afterwards a little bit, I sit down. Usually it's in Sunday school class, but I'm standing right now. When I sit down, it feels so good on my knees, on my feet. Then I get to rest. And then my habit lately has been I take my laptop, because I put the audio that we recorded in the video from the sermon, and I put it on my laptop so that I can take it home, and then I'll spend the next few hours editing that into video footage, audio, sound, uploading it to different websites that do different things in order to produce a Sunday recap and review and have the videos available on YouTube for people who haven't been here in church, that maybe that's their first way of checking it out. Because before you check out a business now, you usually, the way most people do is they check it out online, usually on their phone or their computer, and they do the same thing with churches. So we have those up there so they can at least know what the pastor is going to preach like and what that's going to be about. And so people get a little bit more comfortable with that before coming in to visit. And so I put time into that, but guess what? Sunday is not my day of rest. It's a fairly easy day because most people aren't calling me and texting me and bugging me with my phone, so I've got that part is restful. But it's not just a day that I've spent with God. It's a day that I've spent ministering before the Lord, but it's not a day for the Lord and me to just be together. Yes? It's a great question. Yes. So, okay. So when did the question is when did Sunday become the day of worship? So when you think about it, the first Christians are Jewish. They're the disciples of Jesus are Jews at that point. It wasn't until maybe a few years later where there starts being Samaritan believers and just Gentile believers, Greeks. And so the very first Christians were still, in a way, observant Jews. They were observing the Jewish way of living and the way of life. In fact, years later, when Peter is up in Joppa, sitting on the rooftop of a house of a guy named Simon the Tanner, Simon Peter's there, and he gets a vision from God with the sheet lowered down with all the animals that were supposed to be unclean, unkosher for him to eat. And it says, hey, kill and eat. And he's like, oh no, I've never broken kosher law. I've never eaten anything unclean. And so the idea is that even quite a few years later, for Peter to step outside of the Jewish way of living and observing the Torah is offensive to him. But then he realizes, okay, well, it's okay for me to then go and share fellowship, table fellowship with these Gentiles in the home of Cornelius. So he goes there, and when he returns home, some of the Jewish leaders are like, hey, we heard that you ate with Gentiles. He's like, yeah, I did, and let me tell you what happened. Like they received Christ and the Holy Spirit just like we did. And they're like, oh, so God's granted salvation even to the Gentiles. So in those moments, you started seeing how the Jewish Christians had to adjust their understanding of what it means to be a Christian. Like if even Gentiles can be Christians, the discussion became, do they have to become Jews? Do they have to get circumcised, follow the law? Do they have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian? That became the question. The Apostle Paul would fight that quite a bit, saying, no, they don't. If they receive the Holy Spirit, they clearly have God's mark of approval and acceptance in their lives, so they don't have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. They have to receive Christ and the new birth that he offers. So that said, right after the time of Christ, you've got Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes down, 3,000 believers. Soon after that is 5,000 believers, and the Lord adds to their number daily those who are saved. Now, they did meet daily. That doesn't mean every person was going to a meeting every day, but every day there was a meeting of believers at some place or some point, usually in homes. It says from house to house. They would go from house to house. Wherever there was a hangout or a meetup of Christians, they would hang out there. And they would go over a few things. They would share in fellowship around the table. They'd share meals with each other. They would eat communion. They would celebrate that together. They would talk about the apostles' teaching, and they would pray together. Those are the 4 things that were going on, regular fellowship, regular communion, apostles' teaching, and prayers. And they would do that, together in their homes because they didn't have a church building. They didn't have a designated space. But also what they were doing was they were going to the temple for the times of prayer. The temple, you would have different times of prayer throughout the day. Jews still do this. Muslims still do this. Remember Daniel, when he's in captivity, he still would pray 3 times a day with his windows open facing Jerusalem. Muslims still do that during their calls to prayer facing Mecca or whatever. That was a way of life. And so the Jewish believers were still, and I'm still answering your question, Debbie. The Jewish believers would go to the temple for, let's call it Jewish things, times of prayer, teaching from the Torah. That was all still very important to them. It was part of who they were. But they also knew that they had this new life and power through Christ. Because Peter and John show up to the temple in Acts chapter 3, and they see the beggar there, and the guy's like, you got money? And they're like, no, I'm broke, man. Like, I'm poor. I'm in ministry is what Peter said. Sorry, it's a pastor joke. Like, no, I don't have any money. I'm a pastor. Peter's like, no, I'm in ministry for Jesus. I'm poor. But he says, I got something better than money. And the guy's like, what's better than money? He's like, how about walking? He's like, oh, awesome. And he pulls the guy up and he jumps around and he's like, yeah, I got legs, And some of y'all are like, yeah, I can't do that anymore either. I get it. And so he's like, so he's hanging on to them. They're having a good time. But they're meeting there, but they realize that on the Sabbath day, there's all this Jewish stuff going on. And they don't like when people start talking about Jesus in their Sabbath gatherings or temple gatherings. And so they started arresting him for preaching about the name of Jesus out in the temple courts. So just by sheer necessity and convenience, like if you don't want to be in the middle of service, telling people about Jesus and then get dragged off to be arrested and maybe executed, like that was on the table. They hadn't taken that off the table. They're willing to execute these guys if they don't shut up. And they're like, Jesus told us to speak about this, and he's a higher authority than you, so we're going to listen to him rather than you. Well, by simple necessity, show up on the next day, which for them was Sunday. And they didn't call it the Sabbath day. They didn't rename it as Sabbath. They still observed the Sabbath as they were supposed to as Jews. But they began worshiping Christ on the Lord's day. It happens to be the day that he was risen from the grave, and it happens to be just simple, easy. It's the first day of the week. We're starting out our week worshiping Jesus. That's the day that he rose from the grave. Well, Jews were worshiping on Saturday, which was Sabbath day, so the Christians began worshiping on the Lord's day. They worship Christ on Christ's day, the Lord's day. Now, is there anything more significant as to why they picked that day? I don't know of anything. It's just they had to pick a day, and that day made the most sense. And so, and also, we could basically have a Jewish group meet in here on Saturday, rent space out, because guess what? We don't need it for worship services on Saturday. We're worshiping Christ on Sunday. So, but we're not going to do that. I'm just saying, in theory, you could have both in the same building, because why not, right? But they did that. If they were Jews, they were Christians that were meeting in Jerusalem, the meeting place was at the temple still. Because Jesus was a Jew, he was the fulfillment of the Jewish law. So it wasn't like the Christians thought they had to go somewhere else. There was nowhere else to go. They'd grown up going to the temple. And now I don't know how it worked outside of Jerusalem, like if you go back home to wherever your hometowns were. I don't think they were renting out the local synagogues on Sundays for church services. So I don't know how that worked outside of Jerusalem. I'd be happy to find that out, but if I could find any information on it, but I'm not sure that there is much. But it became out of practicality and necessity that they began meeting on Sundays. Yeah, they had to. Anybody ever been friends with like a Seventh-day Adventist? Yeah. So I had one friend that was Seventh-day Adventist or associate, whatever it was, somebody that I used to kind of work with a little bit here and there. And, one day she says, she had been an Adventist for about 4 years, I think, at that point. And she said, here's her reasons why she became Seventh-day Adventist. And she said, can I ask you why you're not, they call it a Sabbath observer. And, because for them, that's the Sabbath day. Why aren't you a Sabbath observer? And I said, we don't have to talk about this. Like we don't have to be on the same page with this to maintain a working friendship here, And I said, I don't want to make it about that, I'm comfortable with you doing that, and it doesn't bother me at all. And I've got a lot of friends and people that we've partnered with in the time that I've lived in this town, mainly due to Adventist Health being around here. They've got a very big spiritual connection, and they like to connect with the Christian ministries in their communities, and they've been a very good partner in that. And I've grown a lot of respect for a lot of Seventh-day Adventists. But so I'm talking with this gal, and I laid out why, for me, it's not a problem to worship Christ on Sunday, because there's nothing that says on the Sabbath day, like what's the commandment say? On the Sabbath day, you shall not do any work, neither you nor your manservant, your maidservant, nor your ox or donkey, nor the foreigner living within your gates, whatever all it says. I don't have an exact quote on it, but you get the idea. It all addresses work. The Sabbath land rest is the land resting every seventh year. The year of Jubilee is all debts being canceled and all land returned to each other. It doesn't mention worship, does it? See, life is supposed to be about worship, and it goes back to what you were asking, Karen, a little bit. You're already spending your time with God daily, or 90% of the time. But on the Sabbath day, we're given the gift of a special day off, not just to rest from our labors. That's what the commandment addresses. But I think Jesus is getting more to the core, the heart of it, and saying, I want you to connect with your Creator, specifically on this day, in a different way. Because when we've got our to-do lists or our jobs or our tasks that need to be done, if we take a day off but still focused on those tasks and lists, it's not really a day off. It's a scatterbrain day, and you haven't really connected with God or anyone else. Sabbath is about not just resting from labor, but also resting in God or spending time with God. And so that's what we're going to be kind of seeing throughout this study. Is it's more about God getting a hold of our hearts and our lives, and not just causing us to stop. So the seventh day observance or first day of the week observance, the day we go to a worship service, isn't as important, because every day is supposed to be about a worshiping connection with God. But the day that we gather for a service is more than just a Sabbath rest. For many of us, it's not a Sabbath rest. For those who volunteer and serve at the church, you're up earlier than everyone else. You're here earlier. You're probably here later. Like, I wouldn't call that a restful Sabbath day. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But there has to be a day that makes up for that. Jesus acknowledged that even the priests work on the Sabbath, and they're not considered lawbreakers. So what does that mean? an EMT, a ER nurse or doctor, a cop, a pastor, a priest, or whatever, you better take another day. That's your Sabbath rest. If you're working on Sunday or Saturday or whatever it is, there better be a day that you choose, and that's your day. And I know for pastors that's difficult because I'm not just going to turn my phone off. I should maybe, but I'm not just going to turn my phone off because then people say, man, the pastor didn't get back to me. He must be upset with me or, must be annoyed. Well, no, that's not true. But I didn't also call everybody and say, hey, by the way, this is my day off. And I'll tell you, sometimes it's a floating, like I try to get one day a week, but it's not always going to be the same day every week. Because sometimes the day that I might have picked, there might be a preacher's gathering or conference that I needed to attend. There might be somebody that I needed to help out, and I'm working that day. But a different day of the week, there's white space on my calendar. There's nothing planned, and I can take that day off. So I don't just have a button where I can send it out and say, hey, I'm taking Sabbath rest this day. Don't bother me, And so there has to be one day, though, every week. It can't just be, skip a few weeks and then hope that it all works out. Okay, I feel like it's way after time. I have a red clock in the back of the sanctuary that's not here, and so I don't know what time it is. And I was like, it feels like it's afternoon. It's 10 after almost. I'll wrap up if you're done. Yeah, what do you got? Well, I'm okay with that. Yeah. And we could talk a lot about what do you do on a Sabbath day, and we'll probably get into that over the next couple weeks. But yeah, I'm okay with it being a floating day, especially for scheduled things, like I say, emergency personnel and things like that. What I'm not okay with was, I remember when I was 18, I got a job at a Home Depot for a few months, and I told him, I think I told him, I knew that I wouldn't get the job if I told him I couldn't work any Sundays, but I said, I won't come in before 1 o'clock on a Sunday. I'm going to church before I come to work. And I said, I prefer not to work any Sundays, but, I just knew that's how things were working. And so I got that job, and then they scheduled me a couple Sundays, and I said, no, I'm not working this. I told you that. And they're like, oh, yeah, okay, we messed it up. But the store manager, his name was Gary Malik, I still remember that. He said he was Catholic, and he said, oh, I think he understands, meaning God understands when we have to work on Sundays. And I thought, no, it's not about does God understand. It's about do we understand? And I've grown to understand that a lot more. My theology of understanding the Sabbath is growing, over time quite a bit, and for sure a lot since I was 18 years old. But I'm at a point where it's I look back at that and I think, oh sure, God understands real well. He understands every sin in our lives. Doesn't mean that it's okay to do. So what I would say to 18-year-old Nick is listen, if you got to work on a Sunday, which I don't think Home Depot is important enough to say it's necessary to work on Sundays, but if you're in a job where it forces you to work on Sundays, and that job is what is providing for you and your household, then so be it. But also remember that God's ultimately the one providing for you, and that He has said that the way He provides is also in providing a day off, and that on that day that you cease working and spend with Him, that He continues to provide for you. See, when they shut down a factory line because those machines need maintenance, those machines aren't producing anything. They're losing money for their employers. I was thinking a few years ago when we were growing our lawn business, now I'm in a shutdown phase. I'm ready to be done with it. I hate it. I'm tired of it. I've been doing this stuff way too long. But when we were in this growth phase, we bought all these new mowers, and I was like, these aren't making any money when they're sitting in a trailer overnight. I wonder if there's any places where it's fully just business parks and there's lighting all over the place, because I mowed a few places that I could mow in the dark, and it's because they got enough lot lighting. I was like, we need to pick up some accounts that I can have a second crew go out. The first one's tired and they've gone home. Send a second crew out where they can work from 5 p.m. until midnight or something. Wouldn't that be great? These machines don't make any money sitting in a trailer. And then I was looking at ones that were electric mowers. I'm like, ooh, they're quiet, because we'd already bought electric weed eaters and stuff, I'm like, I can buy these electric mowers. You think the other ones are expensive. You can't even afford an electric one. They're nuts. But it's like I can get an electric mower, but then they wouldn't charge in time. So it didn't, and I didn't do any of it, But part of me was thinking it's cooler at that point, This would be a great business model. Can you imagine the nightmare that would have been on my life dealing with those problems, getting called at 11 p.m. when a belt breaks rather than 11 a.m. when a belt breaks on a mower, which happened this week, and I got a call like, belt's broken. Okay, I'll bring you another mower so you can keep working, and it's just like, we're not a machine. We're not valued on how much production we've put out. And God says, unlike those machines at the factory, I want you to stop. But when you stop, I'll cover it. Like, you won't collect manna on the seventh day because on the sixth day there was enough for the seventh day. You won't plant on the seventh year because on the sixth year I'll give you a bumper crop in ways that you can't imagine. So when it comes down to, Micah, where he's like, hey, you've been robbing me in tithes and offerings. And they're like, how have we done that? He said, you robbed me. How? Tithes and offerings. He says, test me in this and see if I won't throw open the floodgates of heaven. We think that means financial provision in our lives right now. What God was saying to them was like, your crops will grow so much more than you could ever imagine that you'll be like the guy that Jesus talked about where he had the big harvest and he says, I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger barns. I can't handle all of this blessing. That's the kind of blessing that God was talking about that he would give them if they just trusted him with their tithes and with their Sabbath. Okay, I'm really done now, but if anybody wants to ask anything else, you can do that. I'm just going to, I know they're hard chairs and we've been here a long time, so I'm going to let you go, and I'll talk with, I think Ed has something right now. I'll talk with you and anyone else.